Hey, Oscar, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity, Mark. I'm really curious to listen to your questions today.
Well, now I feel like there's a little pressure on me. I've got to be actively listening and learning, hearing to understand with you. I'm sure you get that all the time. How are things down under today?
Yeah, we've been hit by a wall of humidity at this time of the year. We're upside down in summertime here, and we got very unseasonably wet weather for this time of the year. Normally we get thunderstorms, but we've had extended wet weather for the best part of 6 weeks. So lots of flooding going on for exactly the same people you would have seen on the news who suffered from those catastrophic fires 2 years ago as well. So, Australia's a land of extremes, whether it's floods or fires or famines. We've had mice plagues as well as pandemics. So it's all happening down here.
You've had everything except snow, as we were mentioning off camera, and we've got to find a way to share the joy of shoveling. I've just spent the better part of last week, the better part of an evening, and it was about knee deep. It was as deep. The snow here in Toronto was as deep as I can ever remember it in our house. And it was such a serene evening of shoveling snow because there's such a blanket that it covers everything. It's so quiet and insulated. So in a fun way, it's great cold exercise.
Yeah, well, speaking of exercising in Toronto, later on I'll tell you about how I nearly got killed running in Toronto, but that's a story for later on.
Wow. Well, that's a story we're going to have to remember. Oscar, I was so excited to talk to you today. So deep listening, impact beyond words. I find an amazing book for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's such an important topic, and it's such an incredibly important topic in professional sales. But boy, leadership. I just came out of a couple of meetings where I'm trying to apply some of the great things that I've learned from your book. And the second thing is it's so well written. This is the kind of book that I'm going to be carrying around in my jacket pocket. It's small but powerful. I played a little bit of hockey when I was younger. I like to say that I was small but powerful. What prompted you to write the book, Oscar? Tell us that story.
Well, like everything, it wasn't prompted by me. It was prompted by the people I work with consistently saying to me, "Hey, Oscar, this is great training," whether it was in a one-on-one context or whether it was in a group context. Do you have a book? It's like, I haven't got time for a book. In my head, the story was, I don't have time for writing a book. And then I went back to the boardroom in 2008. I was in a boardroom in Sydney in April. We were setting the annual budgets for Microsoft Australia between Sydney, Seattle, and Singapore, our regional global head office. There were 18 people on this video conference, and of course it impacts quotas, of course it impacts commissions, of course it impacts the way people sell. And at the 20-minute mark, my vice president looked me straight in the eye and she said, "Oscar, you need to stay behind. I need to speak to you at the end of this meeting." And the only thing that went through my head, Mark, was how many weeks of salary have I got left? Because surely I'm about to be fired. The meeting was scheduled for 90 minutes and a meeting finished at the 70-minute mark. And as everybody left, Tracy said to me, "Can you please close the door?" So in my head now, I'm getting fired in private. And as I close the door and start to walk towards the chair, Tracy says, "You had no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark." Now going through my head, I'm being fired in private and I have no idea why. And as I sat down, Tracy said, "If you could code the way you listen, you could change the world." And Mark, it was something incredibly profound. And there were two parallel processes going on in my mind. The only thing I could blurt out to Tracy was, "Do you mean code or code?" Which was an absurd thing to say.
Microsoft, though.
Exactly. So we're in this software company. And she says to me, "Code, of course, Oscar." because part of it, the conversation we were having was coding professional services, patterns, and projects into repeatable approaches in our budgeting meeting. But honestly, what was going through my head was, woohoo, I haven't been fired. And I honestly didn't really think too much about it. But the book is honoring Tracy as a stepping stone to coding how I listen. Because 2 weeks later, the Chief Financial Officer, Brian, asked me to come into the Cascade meeting where you set the budgets and now you're allocating them out to all the geographies and business units. And Brian was running this meeting and he said, can you come and audit my listening? And I said, oh, Brian, you've been talking to Tracy about this listening caper, haven't you? And he goes, yeah, I have. And I think it's important. I said, I got a 32% uplift on my budget line. I've got to figure out how to deliver that. I haven't got time for this listening caper. And Brian said something to me. He said, if you can help me with the listening, I'm going to help you with the budget lines. Now, I didn't promise relief or anything else like that, but I went into a meeting for the first time in my life and I was literally writing down, oh, he didn't really hear from everybody in the room. Oh, he cut people off. Oh, that wasn't the question they asked. And in that moment, back then, Mark, that was the starting point for coding how I listen. And now we have a listening quiz so people can discover how they listen themselves. And we've got a set of playing cards, and there's everything that's been developed hasn't been as a result of me. It's just been me listening to my clients and people who've interacted with the work to say, hey, could you develop an online course for this? And it takes me a while to make sense of it, but eventually I get there. So that's where it started.
Great story. And by the way, thank you again for sending me those playing cards. It's just a wonderful gift box that I received with the book. I'd already read it. And of course, I couldn't put down a book. Any book that's going to quote Jimi Hendrix goes to the top of my list. So the quote, I think, was, knowledge speaks and wisdom listens. And again, all roads tend to lead back to sales or leadership on this podcast, Oscar, but boy, in our experience today, and admittedly, I'll find myself in the same situation many a time, actively listening to understand versus the age-old, sales process of I'm asking questions to lead somebody down the garden path, to point them into the problem that I solve for. Such just wisdom in this book, like really, there's so many basics here that seem so very important. And I love this one you pull out at the start, which just really caused everybody to think. We get so much time as children where we're taught to speak, but you're never actually taught to listen. And I'm sure there's lots of research behind that. I think somehow you said it was about 2% of people are actually taught to listen. How would you actually even find a stat like that?
Yeah, so 2% of workplace professionals are ever taught how to listen. There's an organization called the International Listening Association based in North America, and they collect those wonderful statistics about listening in the workplace. And the majority of those people listening in the workplace are taught listening through some kind of therapeutic lens. And I always say the kind of listening I want to work with leaders on is very commercial listening. And the difference between managers and leaders, managers listen for what's said, they actively listen. But leaders and powerful salespeople listen for what's not said. They listen beyond the words. And when you understand the neuroscience of speaking and the neuroscience of listening, this kind of makes really good sense straight away. So listening, speaking is a simultaneous equation, but neither exists in isolation. Nobody goes into a meeting and listens 100% of the time, nor do they speak 100% of the time. So mathematically, it's a simultaneous equation where people are speaking and listening all the time. What you want to understand, though, and this is the revelation for most people, once they understand the neuroscience of listening, everything becomes really easy. And it gives them a very simple mathematical way to understand why you need to ask one or two more questions. So I'm going to talk about two elements of this. The first one is your listening speed. For you right now, Mark, and for you listening, you're listening at 400 words per minute, and I'm speaking about 125. I might get up to 150 words per minute. So it means you can listen 4 times faster than I can speak, which means you're designed neurologically to be distracted. You fill in the gaps, you preempt, you problem solve, you anticipate. They've got this problem. Let me pattern match to other clients who have similar problems. Right. So I can sound like a really elegant problem solving professional when it's my turn to speak. Yet, while you're in that space as a shrewd problem-solving machine, you're not actually listening to their problem. You're pattern matching. You're using vital CPU cycles in your mind, or the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, working memory, to pattern match to solve. So what I encourage you to do is, that means you're listening to what they say at 125 words per minute. I want to encourage you to start to listen another 125 words per minute, to listen to how they are saying it. And some really simple heuristics or shortcuts you can use to listen to how they're saying it. Are they speaking about the issue as a positive or a negative? Do they define it as a problem or an opportunity? There's your first thing to listen into. The next thing you want to listen into is their time orientation. Do they speak about time in the past and what might be getting in the way? Do they speak about it in the present? This project is kicking off, etc. Or are they very future orientated? Now, one of the things that sellers struggle with is, sellers are by definition time orientation, future. Always future, occasionally present. They're rarely interested in the past because their quota is for the next quarter.
Right.
With your listening orientation into the future, but if you've got somebody who's stuck in barriers in the past, there's going to be a listening mismatch. So the first one is, do they define the problem as a risk or an opportunity? You need to talk into that. The second one is talking to their time orientation. And the third one is, are they internally orientated or are they externally orientated? And this is at 2 levels, about them as an individual and about the organization. So let's look at that as individual. They'll talk about me and I if they're internally orientated. The thing I struggle with, Mark, is ... right? As opposed to the we's. As a team, we're struggling with. Now I'm going to pause because something just happened for Mark. For those of you unable to see this, I'm going to describe what just happened. His mouth went wide. He went back in his chair. His mouth and shoulders went all the way open. What just happened?
Are you asking me, Oscar? Do you want me to respond? I had an epiphany. I understood what you were saying, and immediately I started assessing that when I'm questioning, am I actually doing that kind of assessment? So this phrasing of saying the I means they're internally focused, the we means they're focused about the business. I started actually trying to understand, how do I speak? Because I'm a we person all the time, us, we. So I started thinking about, what does that say to me? So this is this 125, 400, or, I'm processing things in my brain and maybe not being in the moment in the conversation, but it seemed like I just had an epiphany. That's why I reacted that way. And you could see it, which is why you stopped the conversation. So it wasn't just what I was saying, but how I was reacting.
And in fact, you were saying literally nothing. It was your response to that. And when we're working with clients, they're going to give you so many signals. And people say to me, oh, Oscar, with video and Zoom and remote, the ability to engage with body language is completely evaporated. And I say quite the opposite. It's like risk versus opportunity. I get to stare directly into people's eyes, and they don't think I'm staring into their eyes. I get to look at their body language as I just did with you. So this is a really important opportunity, because if you listen in a mismatched way, this is when people say listening is hard, listening is draining, listening takes time, listening is too slow. Come on, I need to move this opportunity forward. I need to progress it. And what you're doing is you're missing a whole group of buying signals, because you're listening only to what they say, not how they say it. I want to just come back to where we finished off about internal orientation versus external. The other element of that is the organizational view of that. So when a person you're speaking to speaks internally, they'll speak about organizational problems, departmental problems, system problems, service problems, all of that within the context of the organization. Yet there are other people who have a very different orientation. They'll have an external orientation. They'll talk about their clients. They'll talk about their market. They'll talk about the ecosystem. They'll talk about the competition. They'll talk about the regulator, particularly if you're selling any kind of financial services, if you're in manufacturing, where you're manufacturing stuff that's pharmaceutical based. You may be manufacturing things that are air conditioning systems inside buildings. All of these have significant regulatory implications. And an externally orientated person that you're talking to may talk about those things more. Now, your role as the listener is to make sure you balance understanding both their external and internal for them. Now, when Mark kind of stepped back, one of the things he paused at is like, did you actually ask me a question? Because this is not the normal format for the podcast. The format is really simple. The podcast host pitches and I try and hit. And now I'm throwing the ball back to the host. And I'm doing that because I want to role model what good listening feels like, looks like. What's the experience like when Mark felt heard in that moment? So we talked about the 125-400 rule. This is the processing difference, the differential between my speaking speed and your listening speed. Know that you're going to be distracted. And if you start to listen to how people say things, you can stay completely present in not just what they're saying, but also how they're saying it. So I'm going to talk now about the opposite, what just happened for Mark. This is the 125-900 rule. This is the differential between Mark's speaking speed and his thinking speed. So the average thinking speed of a workplace listener is 900 words per minute.
Okay.
Yet if they are in an environment that's dealing with collaborative, resource-constrained, conflict, creativity, any of those characteristics, they'll be thinking up to 1,600 words per minute. Therefore, if you pose a question as a professional seller, business development, or business leader to a person, if you just listen to their first response, you're listening to 14% of what they're thinking. You're leaving 86% of their thinking on the table. And this is all the missed opportunity. If your go-to-market as a selling organization is to sell more products to existing clients, this is where the gold is. This is where your opportunity is to listen beyond that first 125 to 150 words. If your role is to go into new organizations and find new logos, exactly the same. The power is not what they say the first time. If you go back and hit rewind, Mark's response to me while he was processing it, he was still thinking about it. It was so profound in that moment. He said, I had an epiphany. All he could respond with is, oh, are you actually asking me a question? Yeah. So I paused and said, yes, please. Now, for many of us, we struggle with listening to what's said. It's like you'll be listening and going, how do I listen for what's not said? How do I get those extra 125 words out? And the reason you want to listen for this is too many sellers are listening to win against the competition. But what you realize is you're competing against two things more significant than that: inertia, or do nothing, or the business case.
Right.
Which you are competing against multiple demands on the business's capital. Not just, you can beat the competition, but you will have a very slow sales cycle and you'll have a lot of opportunities stuck at the bottom third of your funnel. So if you want to do a quick diagnostic, think about how many opportunities are stuck at the bottom third for more than 90 to 120 days. And the reason they are stuck there is you haven't listened for the business case. So it's really critical. And here's a couple of questions you can ask to get those extra 125 words out. The first one, and by the way, if you're asking questions with more than 8 words, linguistically, that's biased. You're asking biased questions, and you may wish to ask biased questions, but they're unlikely to create rapport or help you to listen to the business case. So shorter the questions, the better. And the shortest question of all, I'll speak to shortly as well. So these questions are so simple. They have 3 words. The first one is, tell me more. Now, as sellers, particularly if you have professional selling methodologies, you may come to a discussion with an orientation is, I'm at this phase in my sales cycle, and I have these 3 questions to ask. You can ask those questions, but each time you do, please ask them one of these 3 questions. The first one is, tell me more. The second one is, and what else? If you want to shorten that question, and I work with organizations who've solved big, complex commercial building design, software companies, they say this little tweak is really helpful. You can just use a very inquisitive and. You can shorten that to and. And the third one is the most difficult to do, but equally it's the most powerful. In the West, we have an awkward relationship with this phrase. We call it the pregnant pause, the awkward silence, the deafening silence. In the East, this phrase is used more than it is in the West. And the phrase is this, so listen carefully. So don't worry, nothing happened in the recording. That was a pause. And too many people think that the speaker collecting their thoughts for the next phrase is their moment to interrupt with their next question. Now, Mark, which one of those 3 questions are most useful for you?
Well, I'm a little biased. We use tell me more in the training as a matter of course. So in every workshop we run, and I'm learning so much more about it through you, Oscar, but that we always like to share with our students that no one in the history of time has ever said, I'm not going to tell you anything else. When you say, tell me more, and maybe I'm understanding today, it's because of the 125-400 rule, they have lots more to say. There's a lot more in their brain, the 400 words a minute versus the 125 that they didn't get out. So I love this idea of the tell me more has been one that we've always used. And what else? Fantastic. And the first time I actually heard that was probably some coaching methodologies. Actually, back to the coaching habit with Michael Bungay Stainer. When you're managing people and you're trying to work with your team, coaching, the end, what else? I think maybe I've got that wrong, but I've heard that and just have always loved it. And the power of silence. People feel, and I think maybe we were leading down a little bit in the old days of a sales process, but the power of just silence, people will keep talking. And now I start to understand they're not just nervous or trying to fill space, but now I'm understanding they didn't get everything out. And there's so much more. And when you talked about the different levels of listening, and one of which is so important, but the 5 levels of listening, and one of them was the unsaid. That was the chapter in the book I really thought was amazing, because it makes so much sense. That just trying to get that next level out from someone so we can really understand, not just hear, but actually understand. And my experience is, so I like all 3. You said which one's most significant. I like all 3 because my belief, I don't want to have to put my money on one, but my objective in every interaction with a client or a prospect is I want to learn from them. I'm going into that interaction. I already know everything about us. I want to really learn about them authentically, with sincerity. I really want to be curious about them and their world and their business. And I just think it's a smart way of selling. If they know and believe that I actually understand them and their business and their industry and their clients and their client's client, if I understand all of that, I'm in a better position to figure out if we can help them. Or if not us, who else could help them?
Yeah.
So, if that's how I enter everything, I just have a feeling that things work out well. And buyers would really enjoy interacting with us a lot more if we all did it.
Yeah. So I want to acknowledge MBS, or Michael Bungay Stanier, as you said, an Aussie transplant to Canada, and not too far away from where you live. His very powerful book, The Coaching Habit, is something I would strongly recommend to any seller, because if you reorientate yourself from being a seller to a buying coach, and you are helping them navigate their business case, not your sale, but their business case, you'll have less opportunity stuck in the bottom third of your funnel. Your referral business will happen quicker, but more importantly, whatever you are selling to that organization will get implemented and used, which then creates more referrals to other clients or other parts of the divisions. Now, before we leave the 125-900 rule, which is the differential between their thinking speed and their speaking speed, we touched on bias questions. One of the things I find sellers going in way too early in a relationship ask too many why questions, not enough how, what, and who questions. And one of the things you will leave a lot of frustration behind if you ask more who questions around not just who's involved in the approval of the expenditure, but who is impacted by its implementation. When you ask that, you overcome both the business case issues and the inertia issues. The inertia issue is, let's just stay with the status quo because the cost of change is too high. There is always a CFO, and I work with them. I work with chief risk officers, and I work with chief actuaries who are always comparing your business case against the status quo. Now, too many sellers are trying to beat the competition without understanding that their biggest competition is, in fact, do nothing.
Yes.
When you ask the who question, who else is impacted by this, not just by the acquisition, but the actual implementation, you'll start to understand where the status quo center of gravity is, and more importantly, what's relevant to them as well. So you can never ask too many who questions, and you can never ask too many how questions. How will this business case be constructed? Not how will this business case be approved? That's the second, third, fifth, maybe the 10th question. but how will the business case be constructed? A lot of the time, the person you're sitting next to will look back at you and go, I don't know, we leave that to finance. Right? And then your role as a buying coach is not to say nothing and move on. Just ask them a really simple question. Speculate with me. What do you think they'd put in there? And then they'll have to think about it. The next question you would ask is, if we were in that room, how would they construct that business case? And then you ask who's in that room. And most often the people who are in that room have got nothing to do with the people you're interacting with, but they can bring those people to you and their objections to the status quo, for example, and make it visible to you. Now, this is deep listening. This is not listening to just what they say. This is listening to how they say it. It's multi-layered. Yet when you do this, pipelines represented in computer software, CRM systems, or sales management systems become a realistic representation of your commercial outcomes rather than a fantasy or a wish list of what might happen. So if you're consistently having opportunities going, oh, we thought that would close on X date, and it keeps rolling on, you're not listening for the status quo. You're just listening to beat the competition. So please ask a few more how questions, ask a few more what questions, ask a few more who questions. Why questions can be perceived early on in the relationship as really judgmental and really confrontational. So I would encourage you to use those questions cautiously when a relationship has rapport.
Oscar, you must have been resisting the urge to again respond to my body language. So the Albert Mehrabian research was coming into play. So because you can't see us, folks, but I was just nodding in agreement so heavily, I probably pulled a muscle in the back of my neck. And the reason is I'm in multiple discussions every week where the core message you just shared about the inertia and the lack of information or understanding of the commercial business case for a deal. First of all, we've seen the stats coming from Gardner and others saying that percentage of deals is continuing to grow exponentially. The last data I saw was 38% of deals fall to no decision. And then the strategy of this intelligent, engaged questioning and listening with the buyers we are working with, I absolutely believe you'll help them understand that they need to think about that, and coaching you're coaching your buyers on how to get this through. And very often we have enthusiastic buyers that haven't thought through that. And it's only at the steering committee meeting that they come back with a sad look on their face saying, well, it didn't make the priority list. And there was this opportunity for us to collaborate with them to help, because we know the kinds of questions that are going to be asked. And we also have insight in terms of other organizations that have found ways of building a business or commercial business case. But we have to have that really authentic discussion with the buyer and how interesting, just the practical questions, who would be most impacted by this, and just getting that insight, what inertia are we going to need to break through? Spectacular. Oscar, let's talk, if we could. One of the things I thought was, I'm amazed, by the way, I have to call it out. I'm amazed at the amazing value we're getting from such a small book. And so this small but powerful book, it's literally a book you could keep in your pocket, your jacket pocket. It probably took maybe 2 hours to read, maybe an hour and a half. I'm so interested. How did you get the amount of wisdom that you've got? How did you boil it down and boil it down? Was that a really difficult process for you, or did it become easy because you've coached and taught this material for so long?
Yeah, it kind of brings a lot of joy to my heart because Kelly, my book editor, and I had a titanic battle. Yeah, Kelly wanted me to write the 250-page book that I call a dust collecting shelf book. Many of them you see behind me, and I wanted the book design was really clear for me, and we spent months and months and months arguing about this, that it needed to be small enough to fit into a lady's bag or a man's jacket pocket. It needed to be read in a flight or in 2 hours. And it needed to be very practical. So I've had people take photos of it and send it to me from all parts of the world, but most often from hotel rooms, from traveling business people. And to me, writing a book is easy. That's the equivalent of beating the competition. But the author's struggle is having the book read and the ideas transmitted. So the change in the design of the book was very deliberate to make sure that I could make every page as useful as possible in whatever context that people were reading it. We had about 140 people review the book before it went out. And I picked probably 25 very brutal assessors for me who were very time poor. And just getting them to read the book originally was the forcing function to go, okay, you've said a lot, Oscar, but say it in less. What is the essentials? I don't know about you and the kinds of food you like, Mark. I love Japanese. I'm a vegetarian, and what they can do with vegetables is spectacular. My favorite dish is called agedashi tofu. And the dashi is a broth. And in my case, it's a multi-layered broth with lots of mushroom and soy and salt and all kinds of complex flavors. But it's a reduction. It is boiled down to the absolute essence. So when you taste it, you taste a very sophisticated, a very nuanced, and a very punchy flavor. And that was driving my design in putting the book together. For each sip of the dashi, how can I create a powerful experience?
Great.
And for me, it was, how do I go, okay, is this page dashi or is it soup? Yeah, like soup is lovely, but you can get watery soup, you can get salty soup. Dashi is something that masters do. It's very sophisticated. It's a passed down recipe. It takes lots of evolution. It's layers and layers and layers of complex flavors. But when you taste it, it's like, wow, that is amazing. So for me, back to your question, it's like, I want the book to be read and applied. I don't want it to just be sitting on a shelf. And the same thought went through when we put together the cards that are the deep listening cards. And you had a suggestion for me to change the name of the cards as well. So I'm definitely taking that on board for the next update of the cards. But I think, what does that mean for sellers is more important. Is your proposal communicating the essence? And is it communicating the essence in their language? Many of us have boiler templates. It makes our proposal generation quicker, more accurate, more consistent. Wonderful. But does it talk to the fact that their time orientation is the past or the future? Does it talk to their time orientation as internal or external? All those things that we talked about earlier on in listening need to be reflected in the artifacts you share with the client. And it's not for the person you're talking to. It's for that person to socialize a document that is going to get your business case over the line. So please, when you're thinking about a proposal, and again, as I mentioned earlier on, I work buyer side and I work seller side, and I don't do your work, Mark. I coach a lot of CFOs and actuaries, program management officers, and founders and business owners. And the one thing they all say is missing from proposals is a very simple one page as close to the beginning that they can put into their business case. If your proposal does not reflect their business case, don't send it. Mm. Take a bit of extra time to put a one-page summary that talks to the way that you have heard their business case will be approved. And if you do, you'll be very excited to get a quick no or a very spectacular quick yes. I would rather have a quick no than a very long drawn out maybe. And I think as sellers, we lose a lot of motivation and energy when we have too many maybes in our pipeline. And that is because we haven't listened to their business case. We're too busy trying to beat the competition or talking about a particular feature that we think is unique to us. So for me, when it comes to your equivalent of giving them a book is your proposal, please, in the first 2 to 3 pages, there must be a page that represents their business case in their language in a way that could be put into an approval process. If somebody has to do the translation, your sale will get lost in translation.
I don't think we can improve on that final comment, Oscar. That wisdom is just spectacular. This book is not soup. This book has been boiled down to the essence. I did just first want to thank you so much for joining us today. I can't imagine anybody listening to this podcast didn't extract actual applicable gold that they can be applying in their next sales call, their next sales meeting. If people want to learn more about you, Oscar, outside of buying deep listening, impact beyond words, and everybody should do that, how else do they learn more and interact with you?
Look, rather than learning more about me and interacting with me, if you'd like to learn more about your own listening, listen to yourself. Go and take the listening quiz, listeningquiz.com, and discover which one of the 4 villains of listening haunts the way you turn up to a conversation, whether you're the interrupting listener, the shrewd listener, the dramatic listener, or the lost listener. This 7-minute survey will give you a 5-page report with an action plan that you can apply straight away. So just pop into listeningquiz.com and learn more about yourself.
I'll be doing that today, Oscar. And again, a sincere thank you so much for joining. What a pleasure meeting you.
Thanks for listening.